From snake oil to fueling a revolution, the dawn of the petroleum age. It is the single most valuable commodity in human history. A sticky black liquid pulled from deep beneath the earth. It fuels our wars, drives our economies, and shapes our politics. It is oil, and its discovery did not just change the world, it defined the concept of a superpower in the 20th century. For millennia, oil was largely a curiosity, used by ancient civilizations for waterproofing, medicine, or rudimentary lamps. In the mid-19th century, it was still primarily refined from whale blubber, a costly and inefficient resource. The need for a stable, abundant fuel source was growing rapidly, driven by the burgeoning industrial revolution and the demand for lighting. Our story of modern oil begins in Titusville, Pennsylvania, in 1859. A former railway conductor named Edwin Drake was hired by the Seneca Oil Company to drill for petroleum. Up until this point, oil was mostly skimmed from streams or dug up in shallow pits. Drake, using a modified salt drilling technique, successfully drilled the world's first commercial oil well. It was a modest success, producing only 25 barrels a day, but the implications were revolutionary. The Drake well sparked an immediate oil rush. Within months, the hills of western Pennsylvania were covered with derricks and makeshift refineries. The era of rock oil had begun. Initially, the primary product was kerosene, a cheap, effective, and smokeless fuel that rapidly replaced whale oil and candles, literally bringing bright, safe light into millions of homes worldwide. Kerosene production was cheap and the financial rewards were immense. However, the industry was chaotic. Production was unpredictable, quality was inconsistent, and price swings were wild. It was this volatility that attracted one of the greatest and most ruthless business minds in American history, John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller, a meticulous bookkeeper from Cleveland, realized the true value was not in drilling, which was pure chaos, but in refining and logistics. He aimed to bring order to the chaos by controlling every aspect of the oil process, from the wellhead to the customer's lamp. In 1870, Rockefeller and his partners founded Standard Oil. His methods were brutal and brilliant. He demanded secret rebates from railroads, undercut rivals ruthlessly, and rapidly bought up competitors. His goal was not market share, it was total control. He was creating a monopoly, forging the concept of the modern corporate giant. By the end of the 19th century, Standard Oil controlled nearly 98% of oil refining and distribution in the United States. Rockefeller had created the world's first true energy superpower, transforming oil from a regional curiosity into an indispensable commodity, just as the internal combustion engine was about to change the world forever. Fueling the future, cars, empires, and the Middle East rush. As John D. Rockefeller consolidated his monopoly, a parallel technological revolution began that shifted oil's primary function from lighting homes to powering transportation. The invention of the internal combustion engine and the mass production of the automobile, spearheaded by figures like Henry Ford, created an insatiable global demand for a new refined product: gasoline, petrol. Oil was no longer just a luxury product for lighting. It became the lifeblood of industrial society. The nation that controlled oil would control the 20th century. This soaring demand prompted a desperate global search for new, vast reserves beyond the United States. The focus of this international energy competition quickly shifted to the Middle East, a region previously deemed insignificant by European powers. The initial breakthrough came in 1901 in Persia, modern-day Iran. A persistent and often desperate English businessman named William Knox D'Arcy secured a massive concession from the Shah, giving him the exclusive right to search for oil across most of the country. After years of failure and near bankruptcy, D'Arcy struck oil in 1908 at Masjed Suleiman. This discovery led directly to the formation of the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, APOC, the forerunner of what would become British Petroleum, BP. The strategic significance of this Persian oil was immediately recognized not by civilian markets, but by the British Admiralty. In 1911, the British First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, made a radical decision. The entire British naval fleet, the backbone of the British Empire, would convert from coal to oil power. Oil-fueled ships were faster, required smaller crews, and could refuel quicker than coal-powered ships. This technological edge was vital, but it created a dangerous vulnerability. The Royal Navy's fuel supply was now dependent entirely on a single, distant source in Persia. To ensure national security, the British government took a historic step in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War I. It bought a majority stake in OPEC. Oil had officially become a core matter of state security, intertwining private corporate wealth with imperial power. The great imperial powers, Britain, France, Germany, and later the United States, were now locked in a frantic geopolitical scramble across the Middle East. They were not searching for ancient treasures. They were searching for black gold, laying the foundation for a century of Western intervention, proxy wars, and political turmoil in the region. The fate of global empires and the prosperity of the modern world were now inextricably linked to the deserts of the Middle East. The fuel of war, oil, logistics, and global conflict. The First World War was the last great conflict fought primarily on coal power. The Second World War was the first fought entirely on oil power. The internal combustion engine, fueling tanks, planes, submarines, and trucks, meant that access to reliable petroleum reserves became the most critical military asset. During World War I, 1914-1918, oil became a strategic weapon. The ability of the Allies, particularly Britain and France, to sustain their mechanized armies and naval fleets depended entirely on securing oil shipments, largely from the United States and the newly developed fields in Persia. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, famously stated that a drop of oil is worth a drop of blood. The logistical struggle to get fuel to the front lines became almost as vital as the battles themselves. The interwar period only intensified the strategic scramble. The vast potential of the Middle East was confirmed with the discovery of massive reserves in Iraq and Saudi Arabia. American, British, and French companies carved up concessions, often with minimal benefit to the local populations, setting up the complex legal and political frameworks that would dominate the region for decades. World War II, 1939-1945, was, in essence, a war for oil. Every major Axis strategic failure can be directly traced back to a fundamental shortage of petroleum. Japan's fatal flaw, lacking domestic oil, Japan's entire war strategy revolved around seizing the oil-rich territories of the Dutch East Indies, modern Indonesia. The attack on Pearl Harbor was launched to prevent the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with this vital oil grab. Germany's Eastern Campaign. Hitler's primary strategic objective on the Eastern Front was not Moscow, but the vast oil fields of the Caucasus, particularly Baku, then part of the USSR. The disastrous and bloody Battle of Stalingrad was fought over the city that controlled access to the Volga River, a key logistical route for Soviet oil supplies. The Allies conversely enjoyed a near-limitless supply of fuel, primarily from the United States and Venezuela, protected by overwhelming naval power. This logistical dominance allowed the U.S. to maintain a massive air force and tank divisions that literally ran circles around the fuel-starved Axis forces. By the end of the war, the world had learned an undeniable lesson. Oil supremacy equals military supremacy. The nation that could produce, refine, and secure the global flow of petroleum would command the global stage. This realization immediately set the stage for the next great global confrontation, not over territory or ideology, but over the control of energy resources, the Cold War. The Seven Sisters, corporate cartel and global control. In the post-World War II era, the power structure of the global oil industry was unprecedentedly concentrated. While nations controlled the political and military might, the actual flow of oil from its extraction to its final sale was controlled by a formidable international cartel. This group was famously dubbed the Seven Sisters by Enrico Mattei, the head of the Italian state oil company. These seven multinational companies were primarily based in the US and Britain, and they effectively controlled the world's petroleum reserves, refining capacity, and distribution networks. The Seven Sisters included 5 American companies: Standard Oil of New Jersey, Exxon; Standard Oil of New York, Mobil; Standard Oil of California, Chevron; Gulf Oil, Texaco. 2 European companies: Anglo-Iranian Oil Company to BP and Royal Dutch Shell. For nearly 3 decades, these sisters operated as a highly coordinated, semi-official cartel. They set global prices, determined production quotas, and negotiated with Middle Eastern potentates. They were the key operators in the region, signing highly favorable concession agreements with local rulers. These agreements typically gave the companies full control over extraction, a massive percentage of the profits, and all operational decisions in exchange for a meager royalty payment to the host country. The sheer volume of oil discovered in the Middle East during this period was staggering, particularly in Saudi Arabia. The vast accessible fields in the region, unlike the smaller, more complex fields in North America, meant that Middle Eastern oil was cheap to extract and virtually limitless in its potential. This corporate dominance established a crucial geopolitical imbalance. While the US and Europe were highly dependent on Middle Eastern oil, the profits flowed overwhelmingly to the Western corporations. The local countries, though sitting on immense wealth, had virtually no control over their most valuable natural resource. This system, however, was fundamentally unstable. The oil-producing nations, often new fragile states emerging from colonial rule, grew increasingly resentful of the exploitation and the lack of political sovereignty over their resources. The stage was being set for a decisive clash between the interests of the powerful Western corporations and the rising tide of nationalism and economic self-determination in the Middle East. This simmering resentment would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Seven Sisters' control and the formation of a powerful counterforce that would fundamentally restructure the global energy landscape. The rise of OPEC, the producers fight back. The vast wealth generated by Middle Eastern oil, almost entirely controlled by the Western Seven Sisters cartel, created a profound and politically explosive tension. Local rulers, struggling to fund modernization and secure popular support, grew tired of receiving only a fraction of the profits from their own resources. This frustration culminated in a powerful wave of resource nationalism. The first major confrontation occurred in Iran in the early 1950s. The democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh led a movement to nationalize the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, AIOC, taking control of Iran's oil away from Britain. Mossadegh became a global symbol of anti-colonial independence. The Western powers, viewing nationalization as an existential threat to their energy security and corporate profits, responded harshly. The US and UK orchestrated a highly successful CIA-backed coup in 1953, overthrowing Mossadegh and restoring the Shah, a pro-Western monarch, to power. This intervention, a clear signal that the West would fight to retain control of oil, would breed decades of resentment in the region. However, the tide of change was irreversible. The oil-producing nations realized that only collective action could challenge the might of the Seven Sisters. In 1960, representatives from 5 major producing nations, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, met in Baghdad. Their goal was modest yet revolutionary: to secure better pricing and revenue splits from the Western companies. They founded the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC. Initially, OPEC was dismissed by the Western powers as a weak trade union, a collection of disparate nations with conflicting interests. The Seven Sisters assumed they could easily divide and conquer the organization, but OPEC's formation marked the first time the producing countries had formally united to assert sovereignty over their natural wealth. For the next decade, OPEC slowly gained confidence and technical expertise, gradually shifting the balance of power through careful negotiations. The major turning point came in the early 1970s, when key OPEC members demanded and won majority ownership and control over their local oil operations, effectively dismantling the concession system established by the Seven Sisters decades earlier. The formation of OPEC was a seismic shift. It transformed oil from a commodity controlled by a corporate cartel into a strategic political and economic weapon controlled by sovereign states. The world would learn the true extent of this shift in 1973, when OPEC first used its collective power not for marginal price increases, but for geopolitical leverage, triggering a global economic crisis. The weaponization of oil. The 1973 crisis. The year 1973 marks the moment the world definitively realized that the power balance had shifted from the consumers to the producers. The price of oil was no longer solely an economic matter. It was a matter of geopolitics and war. On October 6, 1973, during the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The ensuing Yom Kippur War was another devastating conflict in the long history of the Arab-Israeli struggle. The United States quickly intervened, launching a massive airlift of military supplies to support Israel. This support was the catalyst. In response to the overt U.S. backing of their enemy, the Arab members of OPEC, specifically the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, made a calculated, momentous decision. They collectively agreed to implement an oil embargo targeting the United States and other Western nations perceived as supporters of Israel. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic for the West. The embargo simultaneously curtailed production and announced massive price hikes. Crucially, the price of a barrel of crude oil quadrupled almost overnight, soaring from around $3 per barrel to over $12. In the consuming nations of the West, the shock was total. Long lines formed at gasoline stations. Industries reliant on cheap energy ground to a halt and general panic set in. This crisis exposed the deep structural dependency of the developed world on cheap Middle Eastern oil. The age of post-war economic certainty, based on readily available energy, was over. The 1973 oil crisis had three far-reaching effects. 1. Inflation and recession. It triggered massive stagflation, high inflation combined with slow growth, across the US and Europe, fundamentally reshaping Western monetary policy and leading to a decade of economic turbulence. The shift of wealth. It caused the largest, fastest transfer of wealth in history, moving hundreds of billions of dollars from Western consumers and corporations to the treasuries of the oil-producing states, particularly Saudi Arabia. This was the beginning of the massive petrodollar recycling phenomenon. The quest for energy independence. It forced consuming nations, especially the US, to prioritize the search for alternative energy sources and diversify their oil imports, spurring the development of resources in places like the North Sea and Alaska. OPEC had successfully weaponized oil. Black gold had proved its power as the ultimate instrument of global political leverage, forever changing the relationship between the Middle East and the industrialized world. The second oil shock, revolution and instability. If the 1973 crisis was a calculated political move, the second great oil shock was the result of revolutionary chaos. The vulnerability of the global oil supply, proven during the Yom Kippur War, was violently exposed again by political upheaval in a key Middle Eastern state, Iran. The Shah of Iran, who had been reinstalled by the CIA coup in 1953, was a staunch American ally but increasingly autocratic and secular. His lavish spending, fueled by oil revenues, and his brutal suppression of dissent created widespread popular resentment. This resentment culminated in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The revolution successfully overthrew the Shah and installed an anti-Western, theocratic government led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. This event was a major geopolitical earthquake for the United States, as it lost its primary strategic partner and oil supplier in the Persian Gulf. The immediate consequence for the oil market was devastating. Iranian oil production, one of the world's largest, was severely curtailed during the revolutionary turmoil. The market, still highly sensitive from the 1973 embargo, panicked. The price of crude oil doubled again, soaring from around $14 per barrel to over $35 in a matter of months. This second oil shock compounded the economic pain in the West, leading to even more severe inflation and recession throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. The global energy supply was proving to be hostage to the political instability of the Middle East. The instability was immediately followed by outright war. In 1980, motivated by historical rivalry and fears of Iranian revolutionary influence, Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran, sparking the devastating Iran-Iraq War. The war targeted oil facilities and tankers, creating further supply uncertainty and keeping oil prices high. The events of 1979 and 1980 had a massive long-term impact. 1. Strategic focus. They cemented the Persian Gulf as the central axis of global energy policy, leading to increased U.S. military presence and strategic interest in safeguarding shipping lanes. Petrodollar power. The enormous oil revenues created powerful, wealthy states like Saudi Arabia, which used its stable production to solidify its role as OPEC's swing producer and a key U.S. economic partner. The rise of non-OPEC oil. The high prices made oil extraction in previously uneconomical areas profitable. This spurred the development of vast fields in the North Sea, UK, Norway, Alaska, and Mexico, gradually diversifying the global supply and setting the stage for a later price collapse. The revolutionary turmoil in Iran proved that controlling the flow of oil was as important as controlling the price, guaranteeing that black gold would remain the cause of political conflict for decades to come. Price wars and military intervention. The Gulf War era. The oil market entered a new volatile phase in the mid-1980s. The high prices sustained by the crises of 1973 and 1979 inadvertently spurred innovation and investment outside of OPEC. New stable oil supplies from the North Sea, Alaska, and Mexico flooded the market. Coupled with global economic recessions and improved energy efficiency in the West, this led to a massive glut of oil. The high prices collapsed. From a peak of over $35 a barrel, prices plummeted, sometimes falling below $10. This 1986 price crash devastated the economies of highly centralized OPEC producers, including Nigeria, Venezuela, and crucially, Iraq and the Soviet Union. The price collapse directly contributed to geopolitical instability. Iraq's dictator, Saddam Hussein, had emerged from the costly Iran-Iraq war deeply indebted and desperate for cash. He saw the price crash, largely orchestrated by Saudi Arabia's decision to flood the market as an existential economic threat. Saddam's solution was disastrous. In August 1990, claiming historical ties and accusing the small oil-rich nation of overproducing and stealing Iraqi oil, he ordered a full-scale invasion of Kuwait. The world, already nervous about the concentration of oil power in the Persian Gulf, reacted instantly. The fear was that Saddam would not stop at Kuwait. If he seized Saudi Arabia's massive reserves as well, he would effectively control nearly 48% of the world's proven oil reserves. Such control would grant him unprecedented economic and political power over the industrialized nations. The invasion triggered the First Gulf War, 1990-1991. The United States, leading a massive international coalition, launched Operation Desert Storm. The stated goal was to liberate Kuwait, but the implicit crucial goal was to protect the global flow of oil and prevent the region from falling under the control of a hostile power. The war was a quick, decisive military victory for the coalition. However, as Iraqi forces retreated from Kuwait, they set over 700 Kuwaiti oil wells on fire, a catastrophic act of environmental warfare that underscored oil's destructive potential. The Gulf War confirmed the new strategic reality. Oil was no longer just an economic commodity managed by a cartel. The U.S. was now willing to deploy overwhelming military force to guarantee access to the Persian Gulf's reserves, cementing its role as the global guarantor of energy security. Oil had become the primary motive for permanent, large-scale military intervention abroad. The new millennium, peak oil fears, and the rise of China. The turn of the 21st century brought a new set of challenges and uncertainties to the global oil market, defined by geopolitical conflict and unprecedented demand growth. The shadow of oil once again fell over Iraq in 2003. The Second Gulf War, or Iraq War, initiated by a US-led coalition, ultimately removed Saddam Hussein from power. While the stated motivations were tied to weapons of mass destruction and terrorism, the underlying strategic goal of securing stability in a major oil-producing region was undeniable. The invasion led to years of turmoil and disruption, further highlighting the volatility of the global oil supply. Simultaneously, the geopolitical landscape was being redrawn by a single powerful economic force: China. As China's economy industrialized and modernized at a rapid pace, its demand for oil skyrocketed. In the 1990s, China was a net oil exporter. By 2006, it had become the second largest oil consumer in the world, trailing only the United States. This exponential rise in demand put intense pressure on global supplies. This surge in demand, coupled with instability in the Middle East and years of underinvestment in oil exploration, fueled the theory of peak oil. This was the belief, prevalent in the mid-2000s, that global oil production was about to reach its maximum rate, after which it would enter terminal decline, leading to catastrophic price spikes and economic collapse. This fear drove oil prices to unprecedented highs, briefly topping $140 a barrel in 2008. The high prices had a dual effect. 1. Renewed geopolitics. It motivated resource-rich nations like Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, to aggressively use their oil and gas reserves as a tool for geopolitical leverage and foreign policy. 2. Technological breakthrough. Critically, it made previously unprofitable, difficult-to-extract resources financially viable. This spurred the development of new controversial technologies, most notably hydraulic fracking. The widespread adoption of fracking in the United States unlocked vast reserves of previously inaccessible shale oil. This technological revolution was about to rewrite the energy map once again, turning the United States, after decades of increasing reliance on imports, into a potential energy giant. The peak oil fears were soon to be drowned out by a wave of new domestic production. The new energy war, shale, climate, and the future of oil. The final chapter of oil's dominance is being written by two opposing forces, a supply boom driven by technology and a demand challenge driven by environmental necessity. The technological game-changer was the shale revolution in the United States. Through the combination of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracking, the U.S. unlocked massive reserves of crude oil and natural gas in its own territories. This transformed the U.S. from a major net importer into the world's largest oil and gas producer by the mid-2010s, dramatically altering the global energy balance of power. The U.S. regained a level of energy independence not seen since the 1950s, allowing it greater geopolitical flexibility. OPEC, seeing its market share threatened by the relentless U.S. shale production, responded by initiating a price war in 2014 and again in 2020. The goal was to flood the market and force high-cost shale producers out of business. While oil prices crashed, the resilient U.S. shale industry largely survived, leading to years of market volatility. This dynamic tension between OPEC, now often OPEC+, and the U.S. shale industry defines the modern geopolitical oil landscape. However, the most profound long-term threat to oil supremacy comes not from competition but from climate change. Global governments and activists are increasingly focused on the transition away from fossil fuels to prevent catastrophic climate warming. The Paris Agreement and successive environmental goals aim to achieve net zero emissions, necessitating a fundamental shift to renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydropower. Major investment is now pouring into electric vehicle technology, signaling the eventual decline in demand for gasoline. The oil industry today faces an existential dilemma: how to manage its vast reserves and infrastructure in a world actively trying to abandon its product. Oil has been the fuel of modernity, driving global economic growth, winning world wars, and creating and shattering empires. It built our cities, powers our food production, and is the indispensable foundation of our current global order. Yet it is also the primary driver of the climate crisis that threatens the planet. The 21st century will be defined by the difficult global effort to transition away from the black gold that has shaped the last 150 years. The history of oil is the history of the modern world, and its final act will determine the future of human civilization.